Good evening, everyone. In today's session of Management of Financial Services, I am going to start the third unit of your subject. In my previous sessions, I have explained about first and second unit. From this session, I'll be explaining in detail about the third unit. So first of all, in today's session, I'm going to explain what are the various topics you have in your third unit, and then I'm going to explain the first topic of your third unit, that is called hire purchase. Okay. So as you all can see on the screen, these are the topics that you are going to study in Unit 3. So the Unit 3 contains two topics, leasing and hire purchase. So first of all, I am going to explain about hire purchase. What does it mean? What kind of agreement is required for hire purchase? What are the rights of the hirer? So these are the things that I am going to explain in hire purchase. Then I am going to explain about leasing. So first of all, what is leasing, how it is created, then lease evaluation from the lessor's point of view. Then the types of lease, what are the various types of lease. Then I'm going to explain the accounting aspects of lease. Means how the transaction are created in the lease aspect. Means in leasing, what are the accounting aspects. Then funding of the lessor, how leases are funded. So these are the topics that you are going to study in Unit 3. So let's begin with the first topic of Unit 3, which is called hire purchase. So hire purchase, more or less you all are aware about it. When you purchase a product, when you pay the entire amount of the product, you immediately get the product and you can use it and you become the owner of the product. But what if you are not able to pay the entire amount of the product at once? You pay in installment. That process is called hire purchase. When a buyer purchases a particular equipment or product or any type of goods, but instead of paying the entire amount of money, the seller and the buyer comes to an agreement, they create an agreement between themselves that instead of paying the entire amount, the buyer will pay in some installments. The amount will be paid in various number of installments, and the amount of the installment is also decided between the buyer and the seller. So that type of agreement is called hire purchase. So first of all, hire purchase is a method of selling goods. Most of the sellers use this method in order to increase the amount of sale, because there are many people who are unable to pay a large sum of money at once, and installment payment is much easier than payment of a large amount of money at once. So in order to increase the sales of their product, many sellers use this hire purchase method to attract consumers, and they give them different types of offers through which installments can be paid, and they also charge a little bit of interest also in this method. So in a hire purchase transaction, the goods are let out by a finance company creditor to the hire purchase customer. So here, if we consider a certain amount of money or if we consider certain amount of goods are let out by a finance company, that is to be considered as the creditor, and the purchaser or the buyer is considered to be the hirer. Now whenever such installments are paid by the buyer, these installments are considered to be as higher installments. Okay. So here what happens in a hire purchase transaction, the goods are let out, means on the basis of rent. It is given to the purchaser by the finance company, and instead and the buyer is required to pay an agreed amount of money through installment. So first of all, they are going to fix the amount of money which is going to be paid in various number of installments. Now these installments must be paid within a particular time period. Now like in every month the buyer is supposed to pay a certain amount of money as installment. So these are considered to be periodical installment. Means after a certain number of days installments will be paid. So, and the total amount of and the total is all the installments must be paid within a specified time period, whether it is 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year. Each and every detail will be mentioned in the agreement. So installments are paid on a periodical basis within a particular time period. Now come to the ownership of the property. Usually what happens when you pay the entire amount of money, you become the owner of the goods, property, or whatever it may be. But what if you have paid a certain percentage of the product? You have paid the price, like 10% of the price you have paid. So you cannot become the owner of the property. The ownership will still remain with the seller. The seller will be the real owner of the property, and you as a buyer, you will get the possession of the goods just after payment of first installment, or just when you enter into an agreement. The buyer gets the possession of the good, but not the ownership of the goods. The ownership will be transferred only after payment of all the installments. Then only the ownership will be transferred from the seller to the buyer. Okay, so till all the installments are paid by the buyer, the ownership will remain with the seller only. Clear? So these are the basic points, or we can say the meaning of hire purchase. So it is a method which is basically used by different sellers in order to increase the sales of their product. Now the seller and the buyer enter into an agreement. They fix the installment amount. They fix the time period within which the installments will be paid. They also fix the time intervals within which the installments will be paid, and the ownership will remain with the seller until and unless all the installments are paid by the buyer. But the possession of the goods are immediately transferred to the buyer. The buyer is free to use the product just after entering into the agreement. Yeah, but the ownership is transferred only after payment of the last installment. Okay, so these are the some of the basic elements of hire purchase. Now I'm going to explain the main features of hire purchase agreement. So the first point here says that the buyer takes the possession of the goods immediately. So whenever there is an agreement, hire purchase agreement between a buyer and the seller, when both of them enter into the hire purchase agreement, the possession of the goods are immediately transferred from the seller to the buyer. Means suppose you are a buyer of a product and you have entered into a hire purchase agreement, you will immediately get the possession of the goods. Now you can use the goods the way you want. Now the possession is completely different from ownership. Possession means you are free to use the goods, but you are not the owner of the goods. You cannot resell the good to anyone else. Okay, so after entering into the hire purchase agreement, like I said, the possession of the goods are immediately transferred to the buyer, but the buyer is supposed to pay the money in installments. So in the agreement, it will be mentioned that the total amount of money will be paid by the buyer in various number of installments within a specific time period. So that is the first feature of hire purchase agreement. The second one says that each installment is treated as hire charges. Now each installment is treated as certain kind of charge. See, the seller is letting you, giving you the permission to use the product without paying the entire amount of money. So you can assume that you're using a product, you're not the owner of the product, and you're just paying the rent for the usage of the product. So that's why each and every installment is treated as hire charges until and unless all the installments are paid. When all the installments are paid, the buyer becomes the owner of the product. But what if the buyer is unable to pay all the installments? Suppose there are 10 installments of a particular property and the buyer was capable of paying only 5 installments. So what will happen after the payment of 5 installments? The seller can take the possession of the property of the goods, and the installment which is already paid by the buyer will be considered as higher charges, because while making the payment of the installments, the buyer was using the product. So that's why it is considered as higher charges, and that 5 installments which is already paid by the buyer will not be returned by the seller to the buyer. Here, so whatever installments the buyer has paid, it will remain with the seller only. So if the buyer wants to claim or take the possession or the ownership of the product, then he has to pay all the installments. If he fails to pay any installment, then the rest of the installments which are already paid by the buyer is considered as higher charges. That's why all the installments are considered as higher charges. Here, the third feature says that the ownership of goods passes from seller to buyer after the payment of last installment. See, the possession of the goods passes from the seller to buyer while entering into the agreement, but the ownership of the goods are only passed from the seller to the buyer after the payment of last installment. So there are 20 installments of a particular property, and the buyer has paid 19 installments. Now, even after payment of 90 installments, the buyer cannot become the owner of the property or the good. The buyer has to pay all the 20 installments in order to become the owner of the goods. So, only after the payment of the last installment, the ownership of the goods or the property is transferred from the seller to the buyer. Here. Now the fourth feature says that in case the hirer makes any default in payment of any installment, then the seller has the right to repossess the goods. Like I have already explained in the second point, what if the buyer is not able to pay the installment or has defaulted in the payment of installment? What will be its consequence? The seller has full right to take the possession of the goods, and the seller need not pay the paid amount of installment. For example, if the buyer has already paid 4 installments out of 10 installments, but has failed to pay 5th, 6th installment, then the seller has the right to take the possession of the good, and as well as the seller will keep all the 4 installments which is paid by the buyer as higher charges. Here, so if the buyer fails to pay any installment or is unable to pay any installment, the seller can take the possession of the good, and the paid installments will be considered as higher charges. Clear? The last feature here says that the hirer has the right to terminate the agreement at any point of time before the property passes. Now the hirer also has some kind of right. Now you as a buyer or a hirer can terminate the agreement at any point of time, but it must be made before the property passes, the ownership of the property passes to the buyer. Clear? For example, a buyer has paid 7 installments out of 10 installments. Now the buyer has the right to terminate the agreement at that point of time, because the ownership still remains with the seller. But once the ownership passes from the seller to the buyer, then the agreement cannot be terminated. So before the passing of the ownership, the hirer can terminate the agreement. But if the hirer selects or chooses to terminate the agreement without paying all the installments, that means that whatever installment the buyer has paid, that will remain with the seller only. the buyer will not get the paid installments back. Clear? Because like I said, it is going to be considered as hire charges. So if a hirer decides to terminate the agreement in between, then the hirer will give the possession of the goods to the seller, and whatever installment is paid by the hirer will be kept by the seller as considered as hire charges. Okay, so these are the 5 important features of hire purchase agreement. Clear? Now I am going to explain the legal position of hire purchase agreement. Now the Hire Purchase Act 1972 defines a hire purchase agreement as an agreement under which goods are let on hire. Means goods are given on a rent basis. Clear? And under which the hirer has an option to purchase them in accordance with the terms of the agreement which is given below. Now, hire purchase agreement defined the hire purchase agreement is defined as an agreement where the seller lets the good on hire. Means the hirer can take the goods on a rent basis, on a rented basis. Clear? Now it is the option. Now the hirer has the option whether to make all the payment of the installments and get the ownership of the goods, or just to pay few installments, use the product for certain number of days, then return the goods to the seller. So that depends upon the hirer whether to take the entire ownership of the goods by paying all the installments, or just pay some of the installments, use the product for certain number of days, and then give the possession of the goods to the seller. Okay. Now there are the following conditions which are needed to be fulfilled when such kind of agreement is created. So the first one says that payment is to be made in installment over a specified period. Now in hire purchase agreement, entire amount of the product cannot be paid at once. In hire purchase agreement, installments will be paid over a specified time period, 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, whatever it may be, but payment will be made only on the basis of installments. Clear? The second point says that the possession is delivered to the purchaser at the time of entering into the agreement. So whenever the two parties enter into the agreement, immediately after that, the hirer gets the possession of the goods. Not the ownership, but only the possession of the good. Okay. The next one says that the property, the goods, passes to the purchaser on the payment of last installment. Means the property, actually the ownership of the property passes to the purchaser, to the buyer, only after the payment of last installment. Clear? The next one says that each installment is treated as hire purchase, which I already explained in the features, that each installment is to be treated as hire charges. So even if the purchaser fails to pay any installment, the possession will be taken back by the seller, considering all the paid installments as hire charges. Now the last one says that the hirer is free to return the goods at any time without being required to pay any further installment. So once the hirer decides to terminate the agreement, then the hirer need not pay the remaining installments, but the hirer cannot claim the installments which he had already paid. So once the contract is terminated in between, then the hirer do not have to pay the remaining installment, but the hirer cannot even claim the installments which he has already paid. Clear? So these are the legal positions which are defined under Hire Purchase Act 1972. Okay. Now come to hire purchase agreement. Means what kind of elements which are extremely necessary to be disclosed in the hire purchase agreement. So first of all, there is no prescribed form. We cannot say that there are certain rules and regulations or there is certain method which has to be followed by every seller and buyer while entering into the hire purchase agreement or while creating a hire purchase agreement. So there is no prescribed format, but it has to be in written. It has to be signed by both the parties, or else the agreement cannot be it cannot be considered to be legal. So that the agreement must be in written form and it has to be signed by both the parties. Now, these following elements must become part of a hire purchase agreement, or else the hire purchase agreement cannot be considered as a proper contract. Clear? So the first one is the description of goods in a manner sufficient to identify them. Now, whatever goods are given on hire has to be described clearly so that it can be identified with the description. For example, you cannot describe a small, like we can say, suppose a person wants to take a truck on a hire purchase basis, but the description mentioned does not match the actual property or actual truck. So that is not the right way of creating an agreement. The actual description of the property which is given on hire must be described in such a way that it can be easily identified. Here, the hire purchase price of the goods. So the total price of the goods must be mentioned. What is the total amount of the good, that has to be mentioned in the agreement, as well as the installment price. What would be the price or the amount of each installment, that has to be mentioned in the agreement. The next one is the date of commencement of the agreement. Means on from what date the agreement is considered to be, means on which, oh sorry, from which date the agreement has commenced. Like the payment of installment, everything must be mentioned in the agreement. From this date, the agreement will be come into execution, and after that, the buyer will keep on paying the installment within the specified time period at a particular time interval. Clear? The last one says that the number of installments in which the hire purchase price is to be paid and the amount, the due date. So how many number of installment? 5, 6, 10, 12, whatever, it has to be mentioned in the agreement. Price of each installment has to be mentioned in the agreement, and the due date. For example, you have a due date on 1st January. So you can pay the installment on or before 1st January. Then the second due date will be 1st February. Then on or before 1st February, you have to pay the second installment. Even if some kind of extension is given, that needs to be mentioned in the contract. So these are the 4 important elements which needs to be, which must be mentioned in the hire purchase agreement, or else that agreement cannot be considered as a hire purchase agreement. Clear? So this is all about hire purchase, what are the features, legal position, and the agreement. In the next session, I am going to explain the merits and demerits of hire purchase agreement. Then I am going to explain the rights of the hirer, so that you can understand what kind of actions or what are the rights of the hirer, means to what extent the person or the hirer can protect himself from any kind of fraudulent activity and all that. So that I will explain in my next session. Okay, so that's it for today. We will meet in the next session. Thank you.